Here a press briefing on Eastern Partnership futures, 4 scenarios for Eastern Partnership 2030. We're welcoming a very nice group of journalists and commentators. I think that will be just in a couple of moments before we really begin and let everyone connect. So I think there we are. Maybe some additional participants will connect, but we have, I think, most of the group that registered. Welcome, everyone. And this is a press briefing organized by the German Marshall Fund and jointly with the Visegrad Insight on our report, but truly also on the future trends and the future scenarios of for the countries of Eastern Partnership and the Eastern Partnership program overall, perhaps. This is a briefing which is based and relates to the report we launched earlier this year, not really longer than a month and a half ago, exactly in the times of pandemic, when the pandemic began. So we could not meet you in person, otherwise we would be already meeting you and talking to you over different conversations live in various locations. But otherwise, we're bringing this report. I have a copy even with me here. And for those who are interested, we certainly can send by post those reports, or you can expect us when hopefully we will be able to resume travel and meet you in person and bring copies to you. Today, we are with Jörg Vorbrink, the Director for Central Europe at German Marshall Fund, and Alina Inaye, Director of the Black Sea Trust at German Marshall Fund, joining us for this briefing. Both of them very much engaged in this very report, which is not only a publication, it is a larger exercise in which a number of experts from the region of Central and Eastern Europe participated to map out trends that are important globally, but they are specifically pronounced in Eastern Europe. And based on those trends, drivers, the possible developments that we investigated through a series of workshops and also background research, we developed scenarios, 4 scenarios that Jörg Vorbrink will narrate for us. Those scenarios, importantly, were possible through this unique cooperation that we started some time ago with another report of that sort before 2 years ago. This report involves more partners. It was developed also in cooperation with and support from the Visegrad Fund, International Visegrad Fund, Polish MFA, and then a number of different think tanks, expert groups in the region from Ukraine, PRISM, Ukrainian PRISM, from Belarus, iSense and the Belarusian House. A number of participants came from Central Europe, AMO, Association for International Affairs, Center for European Atlantic Dialogue from Hungary, Slovak Foreign Policy Analysis Association. And those partners, along with 30 other participants we essentially recruited from the countries of Eastern Partnership, came together in an important moment for the Eastern Partnership, which is 10 years after this framework has been started, initiated by the European Union. And after 10 years of a lot that happened since then in the dimension of the development of those countries, the European Union is also looking in the perspective for the future. We are relating in this report not only to what the European Union programming is all about, but we try to provide an insight into possible developments within those countries of the region, Eastern Partnership countries, which we enumerate them properly, are Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And we try to explain what's ahead of those countries in order to explain scenarios that are possible, but not necessarily very probable, or we do not discuss the at this point degree of probability for those scenarios. We are trying to be better prepared when it comes to policymaking and public debate and understanding of what's ahead for those countries. As we have seen for the previous 10 years, much of the development was not foreseen, was unforeseen, and yet happening. Here, based on those experiences from the past, and we create some projections that are noteworthy and I think are important to discuss. You can read the full report online at visegradinsight.eu/EAP 2030, Eastern Partnership 2030. And we can also send you copies if you're interested for your work directly to your email, or as paper copies, but of course mind the pandemic circumstances, so that the post may work a little bit longer. Now, I would like Jörg to introduce us to the scenarios themselves, to what have we actually produced in the report, to hint what are those scenarios, and then we'll give the floor to Alina also to discuss the current context for Eastern Partnership countries. Jörg?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Wojciech, and thank you all for joining us on this call. It's a bit unfortunate that we don't have our presentation here. Technically, that was a bit difficult because it's beautifully illustrated again by our Polish partners. So if for no other reason, you should certainly have a look at the report more closely, perhaps through the website or at the hard copy that Wojciech can send you, because it's not just, it wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but it was also an aesthetic one. So I can only encourage you to have a look at that report. Now, Wojciech mentioned it that the report, this entire exercise was done around the 10th anniversary of the Eastern Partnership. It is not an exercise, though, that looks exclusively at the Eastern Partnership, the framework that the EU has rolled out vis-à-vis its Eastern partners, but it is a scenario exercise that looked at the region, the 6 countries, and their possible development in the next 10 years. To emphasize again that these are scenarios and not predictions. These look at trajectories, at key dynamics, at a whole set of trends and ingredients, and basically match these in what we think are plausible combinations. But by no means do these scenarios have any intention to be forecasts. They're also, I should say, not mutually exclusive. These are scenarios, these are trajectories that can morph into one another. So none of these is basically an exclusive sort of track that individual countries or the region as such may take. But they are basically much more dynamic also vis-a-vis one another. They're, in a way, as they are presented, they are sort of ideal, typical, evolve around a key dynamic, but obviously there is many more factors that will play into each of them and change them, adjust them in the next 10 years. We came up with 4 scenarios altogether. There's always obviously more that one can think of, but what we aimed to do here were 4 sort of clear and distinct scenarios that capture the key trends and trajectories that we can think of. Obviously, a lot of variation is possible. We can also discuss some of that. But the 4 ideal types that I'm going to outline here very briefly are the ones that this exercise felt were the most pertinent. The first of these is a scenario that we titled Pragmatic Integration. in a way, it is closest to the status quo. It's basically a further evolution, deepening of the current situation that we have with an Eastern Partnership region where three countries, Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, have taken a very clear path, have associated with the European Union, have deep free trade agreements, have basically dropped all visa requirements mutually with the EU. So there's a set of three countries that are in a forerunner position, if you will, whereas another three have chosen different paths so far, clearly with Belarus and Azerbaijan, somewhat more mixed more recently again with Armenia. And this setting, by and large, is one that we see as continuing, driven by a number of factors. One is that the EU is basically not in a position to make good on any political prospects for the region to have perhaps a membership prospect in the EU. It zooms basically in on less political and more economic and material relationships, the economy, trades, infrastructure, technology. So basically a shift away from any political ambition that there may have been towards more of a material cooperation. This is something that we can imagine suits quite well some, if not all, of the Eastern Partnership countries, because it removes the often very sensitive political package and conditionality, if you will. So we could imagine that this is actually something that for both the forerunners and those three countries that are on a different track in the Eastern Partnership region is quite an attractive proposition, actually. And last, for the large other neighbor that there is in the region, for Russia, this focus on sort of more material cooperation may actually be one that is not only less threatening than anything that involves a political vision, but it may also be something that is attractive for Russia's own economic standing and interaction with Europe. So Russia could actually benefit from that. So for these various reasons, this continued rather pragmatic integration of the Eastern Partnership region is a scenario that stands on its own. But if we fast forward 10 years, then we basically see an Eastern Partnership at 20 that looks very similar to the one at 10, but perhaps with deepened degrees of cooperation, of interaction, of connectivity, but with basically a preserved, unclear political perspective for the six countries. Now, if we move over to the second scenario, which we titled Russian Hegemony Revisited, then there's more action in this. In the first scenario, we have something that is somewhat stagnant, whereas in this second scenario, we see a very clear and concerted effort by Russia to re-establish its sway over the region, its hegemony, its levers, its influence, politically, economically, and socially. Basically, an effort by Moscow to fully re-establish its zone of influence in the region, and this takes place against the background of an EU and NATO that are not able to prevent that, not in a position to make sort of very attractive propositions to the countries of the Eastern Partnership, but rather basically is in a mode of introversion and passivity to the Eastern Europe region that facilitates Russia sort of moving in more strongly again. We all know the arsenal that Russia exploits or employs in this pursuit. It will certainly play out countries specifically in very different ways. In the last years, especially, there's much more talk again about political integration, for instance, between Belarus and Russia. So there is a country that may be drawn as an example here into the Russian influence in a way that we could imagine, if successful, broadens across the region or establishes an example, perhaps. So the ultimate aim in this scenario is Russia's re-establishment of its role vis-a-vis its neighbors. Basically, the veto power that it wants to be in all matters, domestic and external, and it achieves this aim in the coming decade in this scenario, basically turning the Eastern Partnership into a Russian patronage. Now, moving over to the third of our scenarios, which we titled EU Pivot to Moscow. And this is a scenario that we imagine takes up some of the discussion that we've seen in the last years over a normalization of relations between the West and Russia. You may remember that over the years, there have been a number of calls for a new grand bargain with Russia, a way of retrieving ourselves from the strained relations with Russia as they have emerged, especially since the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And there may be a number of reasons on the part of the EU, especially, to seek such an accord with Russia, whatever form it takes. We see that the political unity vis-a-vis Russia in Europe is quite strained and maybe faltering. The sanctions are an everlasting topic, and an example here. There's a growing role of China. There is economic pressures, especially as we see emerging now in the COVID situation. There is loosening transatlantic ties. There is hopes perhaps for a transition of power in Russia. So some of these or all of these come together and basically push the EU in a direction where it tries to strike an accord with Russia. In this scenario, we see this bargain, as it were, to evolve around two key issues. The one is security, the other one is the economy / energy. And with a focus on both of these, the EU tries to normalize its relationship cooperation with Russia, and it will do so at the expense of the Eastern European neighbors. It will basically act above their heads. This is a situation that these countries are very, very sensitive to. They're in between those large neighbors, and they see themselves as being downgraded to secondary players, being seen again only as an appendix, basically, to EU-Russia relations. So there's a massive fallout for the countries of the Eastern Partnership in such a scenario. And it will basically perhaps lead to a degree of normalization of EU-Russia ties, but it will also induce massive volatility to the region of the Eastern Partnership, because anything that happens in the region, anything that also Russia may do vis-a-vis these countries, will obviously be seen and perhaps sacrificed to EU-Russia ties. So the EU, perhaps by wanting to reach a greater degree of stability across Europe, including Eastern Europe, by reaching out to Russia, at least in the Eastern Partnership, achieves the opposite, much more volatility and instability. Now, finally, our fourth scenario is of a slightly different nature. I mean, the first three scenarios were all shaped by external dynamics, Russia, the EU, even beyond that. Whereas in this fourth scenario, which we titled Civic Emancipation, we basically posit that there is an important impulse that comes from within individual countries. And there's a number of ingredients that we see in place and emerging that may combine in the direction of a scenario whereby from within, through a mobilization, including civil society, citizens at large, you see a shift or a push for improvement and development in the Eastern Partnership countries, perhaps not across all of them equally, but certainly in some of them. The background to this is that it is very clear that in all these countries, states have a degree of failure when it comes to addressing key needs of the populations in these countries. Some of these are security, some of these are also socio-economic in the direction of welfare, public health, education, sort of the prospects for the younger generation. So what we see here is basically a situation where societies do face massive challenges, but they don't have states and state structures in place, or they don't see them and don't have confidence in them. They would be able to improve their lot. We also see that more globally, there's a lot more political discontent that shows in public mobilization and movements. So there's a broader background to this. And the last here is that I think increasingly in the Eastern Partnership countries, we see an acknowledgement emerging in societies that they will basically not be able to rely on external friends and partners. It's not going to be Russia or the EU or the US or China, for that matter, that will improve their situation sustainably in the long run. But the acknowledgement is I think, taking place, that societies will have to take their fate into their own hands much more than they have perhaps in the past. So if you combine these various elements, if you add perhaps a quite ossified post-Soviet political elites, state structures, then you have ingredients in place that may sort of be conducive to a civic upsurge that puts in place a new generation of leaderships, a reform agenda, even in political and economic terms. And that, if playing out in the next 10 years, may well lead to a situation whereby the Eastern Partnership region looks a lot better than it does today. And it does so by being driven towards development and positive improvements from within. So this may be a somewhat idealistic scenario, but it's certainly one that we believe is plausible, and certainly one that we should all hope for. So these were the 4 scenarios. There's certainly a lot of room for discussion on each and all of them. They, in the report, are also presented in much more nuance when it comes to individual countries and the way that individual countries relate or place themselves in these 4 scenarios. But for a broad overview, I think this may suffice here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jörg. And just before I give the floor to Alina, let me remind you that, first of all, you see recording. So GMF is recording this webinar. If anyone needed the recording and the audio of it for any quote, this is on the record. And secondly, let me encourage you already to put your questions to the chat box, or signal that you wanted to ask a question directly by raising your hand or indicating so in the chat box. We will monitor that, and I will unmute you so that you're able to do that. But now, Alina, the floor is yours. Over to you, perhaps with some input on the recent state of affairs. EU is actually looking into the current state of affairs in Eastern Partnership, very much also in the relationship to COVID-19. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is very correct. Jörg has outlined the 4 scenarios, which were, as both of you mentioned, developed before the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis started. So what I will do is I will just add a little bit of information and opinion to what is going on, what has been going on once the crisis started, to better understand the 4 possible scenarios and possibly choose one of them if you're so inclined. So first of all, on the positive side of things, yes, indeed, the European Commission, I wouldn't say EU, I would say the European Commission, is looking at the Eastern Partnership countries, is interested in the Eastern Partnership countries. Right after the crisis started, the COVID-19 crisis started, there has been a new report on Eastern Partnership coming out from the Commission, which wasn't only looking backward, but was also looking forward with intentions of what the European Commission would intend to do, would like to do in the Eastern Partnership countries, and how it sees the future of the partnership. Moreover, not only was the report is indicating, as I said, the interest of the Commission in Eastern Partnership countries, but money, funds were made available to Eastern Partnership countries. 140 million euros were being made available to help them weather the COVID crisis, and an additional 11.3 million euros were available to civil societies in these countries as grants. As grants. It's not a lot of money, but it was money, probably, but it was money that was released very, very rapidly and without very much debate within the EU and within the European Commission, once again showing on the positive side of things that there is interest out there and the Eastern Partnership countries have not been forgotten. However, there are concerns, and there are a few, 5 I've identified, concerning trends, I would say, in the Eastern Partnership countries. As I go through them, and I'll be very quick, you will see they're not necessarily specific to the Eastern Partnership countries only, but I think they are more acute here in this region. First of all, the state of the economies in the 6 countries was pretty poor before the COVID-19 crisis, so the crisis only adds to this. We have high unemployment, higher unemployment than probably ever before, which make many think and be concerned with possible protests, people protesting on the streets, taking their poverty and taking their job losses to the streets, protesting the poverty, as I said. First of all. Second, the governments of these countries are not the most democratic governments in the world, to put it very, very mildly. And there are concerns that the restrictions which have been placed on freedoms and individual freedoms and liberties in the context of the COVID-19 crisis will not be lifted soon enough, or will not be lifted and restored to the state which was there before the crisis started, and that the governments will use the COVID-19 crisis to continue their crackdowns on civil societies, on opposition, and in general in tightening the public and civic space and political space. Third, as we speak and as the COVID-19 crisis unfolds, Moscow is not sitting still, and Russia is not sitting still. Moscow continues to militarize Eastern Ukraine. There are convoys going from Russia into Ukraine as the COVID-19 crisis unfolds. Moscow is giving loans to countries in the Eastern Partnership, just gave a loan to Moldova. So they are pursuing all of their soft and not so soft power. They continue to do so even as the crisis unfolds. And the concern is there that as these economies, which were weak in the beginning, which are weak now, which will become even weaker as an effect of the COVID-19 crisis, will be thirsty, will be even more thirsty for cash, will be even more thirsty for investments, and they will take money from wherever available, Russia included, China included. China is also out there with promises, not cash yet, but promises and promised investments. Third, there is a very strong disinformation campaign going on in these countries, as it goes in other countries in Europe as well and in the US, on the sources of the COVID-19 crisis, on the weaknesses of the European Union, on the weaknesses of the transatlantic model and of the transatlantic institutions. Everything is used to denigrate European Union, to present it as a much weaker actor than it actually is, and to present, obviously, Russia and China as the saviors of this region. Again, this is not specific to this region, but it's more acute here because the audience is wider, because people speak Russian language, so they are more reachable by the Russian propaganda. And last but not least, which somehow is related to the illiberal concerns for the region, there are upcoming elections in some countries, in a few countries in the region, upcoming elections in the fall. And there are concerns that, first of all, these elections will not be able to be monitored as they used to be traditionally. And with the governments, which, as I said, are not the most democratic in the world, the fairness and the freedom of these elections are being put under question. And last but not least, all of these countries, all of these governments are already in electoral mode. They make electoral promises, they make populist promises that they won't be necessarily able to keep in the context of the economic crisis. So you will see people being confused. You will see people being even more frustrated once these promises will not be able to be met. And you see governments which are very reluctant in taking the measures which are supposed to be taken when a crisis this important hits your economy, hits your country. And every delay costs money, every delay costs jobs, every day of delay costs jobs, and it just worsens the situation. So these are the concerning trends that I see in the region. Again, not specific to the region, but much more severe than in other parts of the world, of the continent, actually.
Thank you, Alina. This was a great introduction to a very complex situation. Of course, we're discussing situation of 6 different countries, different in all aspects. The fact that they're part of the Eastern Partnership doesn't make them similar, but yet there are several patterns that, given the differences between those countries, may allow some generalization or similar. We can talk about similar trends. Now we have already 2 questions. The first one comes from Dimitro Shkurko. Now I will allow him to speak. Now you're unmuted, or you should be unmuted now. Please go ahead with your question, unless or you may want me to read it out loud.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just allow me, please, a short comment on the scenarios you just presented. From my perspective, and it's quite difficult to say about other countries of the Eastern Partnership, but for Ukraine and for myself as a Ukrainian citizen, the best scenario is quite dangerous. And I can explain you why, because, if you refuse the demand for example, Ukrainian population in their choice for European integration, that immediately will lead to the second scenario, to the real war. And there is 2 factors. First, it is not maybe exactly necessary to repeat the Yanukovych mistake, who also tried to refuse Ukraine from the European choice. And the second reason is that if you just give up the political ambitions of Ukrainians and concerning Ukraine, that will not feed the predator. Just because, if you will speak with any Russian politician, I mean, formally or informally, and you can make a conclusion that the main target for them is not Ukraine. Ukraine is only the mean, and they are targeting a much larger target, as, for example, to destroy European Union or NATO. And you can recognize that or not, but it does not change the reality. And it was my comment. And right now, my question is, first one, how much that idea to reject any kind of possibility for Eastern European countries to pretend to join the EU and NATO, for example, is shared by US government. So that is it some kind of reflection of official position, or at least trends which are existing? And the second question, my question is, if Western democracies retreat or will recognize it defeat in that psychological struggle with Russia in that regard, how that could assist in the civil transformation inside Russia itself, just because the only one result of such kind of attempts to pacify Russia in such a manner will lead to rising the aggression from the side of Russia, including the aggression inside the Russian society. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks. I think we can start answering those questions directly, unless you want to. We can give some more time. And because we have other questions also waiting.
Let's go with some more questions.
Yeah, and we will. So, but the questions are great questions. Thank you again, Dimitro. Now I will ask Ricard. Sorry, it just takes a moment before I.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Yes.
Hi, guys. So my question is: we've seen in the last few years that key EU member states, most notably France, have tried to water down ambitious EU language on the Eastern Partnership. This was actually something that happened this week when EU ambassadors discussed Eastern Partnership Council conclusions. And already agreed language that are in the association agreements, in previous Eastern Partnership documents, on issues such as sectoral alignment with EU rules or acknowledgement of European aspirations is being questioned right now by Paris, but also by others hiding behind them. So I wonder, what impact do you think this will have on the EAP frontrunners, the three association countries, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine? I mean, at some point they will grow quite disillusioned, I believe, when they see this sort of thing, because it's not passed unnoticed. And a possible follow-up on that, is it really possible to make especially these three frontrunners undergo tough reforms? Because that's really what the EU is asking them to do, tough reforms, without the promise of what we call the light at the end of the tunnel, i.e. the carrot of future membership. We all know from the enlargements of 2004 and 2007, the great Central Eastern enlargement, that the only reason that happened, that they could reform so much, was that they knew that something would happen at the end of it. They would become EU members, NATO members, whatever. This carrot is not there anymore. And quite frankly, I know that some of you will say maybe that, oh, you need to reform for the sake of reform, but that's not a vote winner. That's not the way you keep yourself in power. That's not the way you do things. You don't reform for the sake of reforming. There must be some reason for it. So I wonder really, can we really ask anything of these countries without actually offering something concrete other than just fulfilling the DCFTA and the association agreements?
Thank you. Fantastic question again. We noted those two questions down, and I would now ask Alexandru also to speak. And I see there is a question in the chat box. Alexandru?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I have read all the scenarios. They're interesting analysis and projection, possible projection. But as I said in my written question, I think okay, there's a very interesting analysis of the positioning between EU and Russia, but I think there are at least two main actors. I mean, United States and China. They are mentioned, but only briefly. And I think in all this game, not only in Eastern Partnership, but also in what I see, and it was mentioned from our colleague in Ukraine about the Eastern Europe itself, part of the EU as a game in this action between this discussion between and a possible reconfiguration of the spheres of influence. And so I would like to ask, how do you see this game in four? I think EU, US, China, and Russia, because I think this is will be a key element. We are in a very transitional phase in which geopolitical status quo is shaken, and we don't know what will happen. 10 years is a very long time. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Fantastic. 5 questions. I'm sure we will still have time for another round, but now let's close this one. And Alina, would you be okay to start to begin with? Whether, I mean, you can pick, or I can ask you directly which.
No, you don't need to ask me. No, thank you. I will start. I think I've got all of the 5 questions down. I won't necessarily answer all of them, because I'm sure you will pick up from where I will leave. First of all, Alexandru Lazescu, there is a fifth power in the region which you haven't mentioned, which is important, especially in Southern Caucasus, and this is Iran. And that I don't think we should be not talking about Iran in the region, at least in these 3 countries, as I mentioned. We had yesterday a very interesting brief with George Kent, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Eastern Partnership countries, for Eastern Europe. And he was asked exactly this question: what is the role the US sees for itself in the region? The role that the EU sees for itself is somewhat more clear. And will the US continue to play this role, whatever it is that it sees? And the answer was very clear, two-folded and very clear. First of all, the US will continue to provide security for this region, to project security for this region, as it has done in the past. Even if the crisis is going to hit and has hit the US economy, their intention to continue to provide, to project security in this region has not diminished. And second, US will continue to cooperate with these governments, will continue to press the governments in the region to continue their economic reforms and to continue their democratic reforms. More insistence was put on the economic reforms, to be quite frank, than on the democratic reforms. But however, US will continue to try to play a role here as well. Which brings me to the question on, can we actually ask these countries to reform when there is no sugar on the plate? Yes, we can. And it's not only us who can ask them to reform for the sake of reforms, as was written, but it's also their business community, the business community in these countries, who has already asked the governments to reform. And if you look at the dynamics between the governments of these countries, as undemocratic, as resistant to reforms as they are, and the business community in these countries, you will see that the latter is much more influential than it used to be, has a much stronger voice when it comes to the government, and it's much more directly interested into cooperating with you, into adapting the acquis communautaire, whatever it needs to adapt, in order to continue to sell to the EU, to get technology from the EU. So it's getting more transactional, yes, indeed, but in a way, this is what's gonna put pressure on these governments to reform little by little, if not you know, all at once. And last question, which I'm going to address, it's about civil transformation inside Russia. This has always been the narrative that once these countries in Eastern Partnership reform, once Ukraine reforms, once Ukraine becomes democratic, Russia will follow suit and will become more democratic. I think the recent history has proven this narrative wrong. I don't think Russia is on the path to do any sort of positive civil transformation anytime soon. I think with the COVID crisis and the oil prices going down, Russia is going to be more aggressive rather than less aggressive in the region and inside its own borders. So it's gonna be even tougher before it's going to be better, and some room for reforms are going to be there in Russia.
Thank you, Alina. York?
Yeah, thanks. There is one or two questions left that I should certainly respond to. Dmitry, your first question: to which extent is this, or are these perspectives that reflect any form of vision or analysis of the US government? That really is a question to the US government. I mean, the German Marshall Fund is an American foundation, but in this exercise that we did with partners primarily from the Eastern Partnership countries and from Central Europe, there was no US government sort of involvement or input even entirely. So don't read these scenarios too much as a reflection of outside players, whether it's the US or the EU, but much more as a reflection of sort of how these players are being perceived by experts, by civil society, also leaderships in the Eastern Partnership countries. And this is, I think, where it gets interesting. If you look at these scenarios, there is a lot of EU in them, that's right. But at the same time, these scenarios mostly are rather skeptical about the capacity of the EU to be a very strong player in the Eastern Partnership countries. So what you see across all these scenarios is a rather sort of muted and lowered expectation towards the EU, certainly towards the US, but also China. So I mean, if you approach it from that end, then I think you get closer to where these scenarios really reflect views from the Eastern Partnership countries. So in that sense, I would turn your question around even. Richard, your question, the sort of discussions about the Eastern Partnership provisions, the watering down more recently in the discussions. I mean, first of all, of course, this will have an impact on all the Eastern Partnership countries, and especially on the three that are frontrunners. It can only be frustrating them, and it will be. And this is a discussion that I think these countries have witnessed over and over again for 10 years and more, whereby the EU basically holds out some hopes, provides support, also gives a number of conditions, but does not seem to be willing to go beyond a certain point that provides a clear perspective to the Eastern Partnership countries overall. And I think this will continue to be a sore point for many countries in the region, and for many of those who want to reform their countries. So I think this is, at the very least, this is it's not prudent to question things that have been agreed, that are sort of printed out and signed in agreements that already exist. But I think it's a repeat impulse from inside of the European Union, from some countries, that is, not all, to basically question whether or not these Eastern European countries are really worth it. That's basically what it boils down to. I think there's a second frustrating element in the dynamics at the moment, that is the three frontrunners were basically hoping for a changing format of the Eastern Partnership, whereby where their frontrunner position would be acknowledged, where you have three countries that would be more privileged Eastern Partnership countries, neighbors, and partners than the other three that have a different political trajectory. This is something that the EU has rejected. The EU is clearly intent on keeping the Eastern Partnership as a format for all six countries. And I think here again, this will be frustrating for the three frontrunner countries as we go forward.
Thanks. Thank you, Jörg. Well, on my side, I can add on also exactly on those points that this, even in the recent communication council conclusions on Eastern Partnership policy that were finalized and published 2 days ago, we read a lot about flexibility and but no word of acknowledging any of the ambitions of the three mentioned countries to fast forward and fast track or speed up from a framework of Eastern Partnership, which from the very beginning was very ambitious, but as some countries move faster on the economic integration and political association, ambitions also grow. And perhaps for those, it seemed not that the Eastern Partnership is not delivering. At the same time, suggestions that we have heard from France are actually suggesting that we also hear from the Commission that the whole framework on building a relationship with neighborhood and potential enlargement for any future enlargement needs to be fundamentally rethought. And it's not about any particular country. We're talking now about Eastern Partnership, but in a larger context, also Western Balkans, because the enlargements and the premises of
Have we lost Wojtek?
enlargement.
Wojtek, you're breaking up.
So Jörg, may I suggest that we take 2 more questions and try to answer them as well?
Absolutely. I see that Richard has a follow-up question. You want to go ahead, Richard?
Yeah, it's a question for you, Jörg, because you mentioned that's a quite interesting thing, this whole thing about the front runners getting something more and perhaps even a sort of split of the Eastern Partnership. I've heard it especially from Ukrainians and Georgian politicians who are often saying that they are, they're embarrassed to be in the same room as Belarusians and Azerbaijanis. They don't want to be there anymore. They don't belong there anymore. So I ask specifically to you, do you think, I know that the EU doesn't want it, but do you think it would make sense to split up the Eastern Partnership and have two separate categories and perhaps joint meetings between Georgian, Ukrainians and Moldovans with the EU, and then perhaps the Armenians, Azeris and Belarusians on the other side for some other thing? So basically, is it time to scrap the Eastern Partnership and split it into two? That's my question to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really in two minds here, because first, I think the Eastern Partnership format has quite some merits. I do think it hasn't been a failure by all means. I mean, however turbulent the last 10 years may have been, I think the Eastern Partnership has proven to be quite a valuable format. So if any adjustments are to be made to this, then I'm certainly not opposed to them, but I think they shouldn't start out from the assumption that the Eastern Partnership has failed here or there necessarily. The second is the three front-runner countries aren't precisely on an easy and straightforward linear path in their development. There's setbacks in all these countries. Ukraine has been catching up quite remarkably over the last number of years, but at different stages of the Eastern Partnership over the last 10 years, we've seen different countries being put in the #1 spot as the sort of model case. At some stages was Moldova, and now it's been removed from that #1 position. So I think there's quite some dynamism here. So being a front runner now does not necessarily mean that you're still a front runner in 5 or 8 years from now. And sort of basing the format of this overall program on the sort of on the moment, as it were, on the current position of an individual country vis-a-vis others, I think it's not a prudent thing. I also think that sort of dividing up or sort of separating the other three countries from those three forerunners will potentially be quite damaging to dynamics in those countries. I mean, we have seen quite some positive development in Armenia. Some of it is also related, I think, to the aspect that the EU has not given up on Armenia once Armenia decided or was forced to step back from its association agreement. Instead, they found a different format. So more often than not, I think we also use the wrong language here, including from some of the forerunner countries. Belarus has not decided against the Eastern Partnership. Neither has Azerbaijan. The leaderships in those countries have, but neither of those leaderships are particularly democratically legitimate. Have we asked the populations there? They certainly would like to have a more constructive relationship with all partners, including the EU. So what I would want to avoid here is a situation where we basically punish three countries in order to elevate three frontrunner countries. If anything, I think that the Eastern Partnership can be kept as a format for 6 countries, but there should be more pluses to those who want to go ahead, who are more sort of positively developing. I think there must be add-ons that we can provide to Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine at this stage that we don't have to offer to the others, but we can keep the Eastern Partnership format in place.
I don't see any other questions, or I don't see any question that we haven't answered. Jörg, do you?
No, I'm also looking at the chat. I don't see anything that we haven't responded to, or I hope so at least.
Is there anything that you'd like to add then, in addition to what was already said, and maybe we forgot to answer one of the questions before we end, because I'm looking at the time as well.
Yeah, maybe perhaps as a somewhat general characterization of again of some of these of this exercise and the scenarios. I mean, I was surprised by a number of points. One aspect that surprised me is that our participants didn't come up with an absolutely catastrophic scenario, with anything that would sort of pull the entire Eastern Partnership region into complete disaster. Now, we shouldn't forget that 5 out of 6 Eastern Partnership countries are embroiled in more or less frozen conflicts. There's a more or less open war going on in the east of Ukraine. There's the annexation of Crimea. So there's plenty of conflict. But I was surprised that there was no more catastrophic scenarios that would even broaden some of these military and violent confrontations in the region. I found that surprising because I do think there is potential for more conflict again. The second point that I found surprising is, I mentioned it before in response to Rickard's question, I think the expectations are relatively low to the EU. I think the countries have gone through, or several of the countries have gone through enough disappointments from the EU side to have relatively low expectations. I think they're watching the EU very closely. They know a lot more about about Europe / the EU than, for instance, the Central Europeans knew in the early 90s. So there's, I think, much less of an illusion here. But I was still surprised because the EU fashions itself as a major player, and it is, but it doesn't seem to be perceived as such necessarily. I noted, my third point, I noted in our exercise that there's almost no expectations to the US when it comes to sort of a more comprehensive picture of the region over the next 10 years. There is sort of pointed moments of US sort of significance, as it were, in the region. Most of them probably related to security, especially when it comes to Georgia, Ukraine. But other than that, our participants don't seem to be seeing the US as a particularly impactful player in this part of Europe. They rather see the retreat that the US seems to have embarked on from Europe broadly and from Eastern Europe in particular. My last point is, I also didn't notice sort of much of a desire amongst our participants from the Eastern Partnership countries to go for a very enthusiastic scenario. So if we go back to the 1990s in Central Europe, I think there was much more sort of enthusiasm, return to Europe, it was labeled back then. You don't have a similar enthusiasm in the Eastern Partnership countries, as far as I can see. I think there is a sober acknowledgement for the need to develop, to reform, including in some of the more closed countries like Belarus. But there doesn't seem to be an excessive enthusiasm that this will lead them to be the new Poland anytime soon. Whatever that means these days.
Yeah, exactly, whatever that means these days. Thank you very much, Jörg. Thank you everybody who attended this briefing. Once again, I do encourage, and I know that Jörg encourages you as well, to look up for the report. We can also send copies of the report if you're so interested, because there are many more details, many more valuable information, and it looks very, very, very nicely as well. Thank you everybody. Thank you, Jörg. Thank you, Wojtek, wherever you disappeared in the fourth dimension.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alina. Thanks, Wojtek. Thanks, everybody. Bye then.